Hello, everybody. We're going to wait just a minute or two as people file in. So welcome, and we'll start in just a second. Okay, we're going to start, and I'm sure more people will be filing in. So hello, everyone. My name is Liz Hume. I'm the acting CEO of the Alliance for Peacebuilding, and welcome today to this session on democracy. The title and the topic, I think, is really critical in the United States. Mainly, one of the things I was talking about with the panelists earlier is that it doesn't really have a home in US agencies, as opposed to violent extremism programming, which would be at the Department of Homeland Security or Education or Department of Justice and law enforcement. Democracy, rebuilding, securing democracy, this is a cross-cutting issue across many agencies. So it's a harder nut to crack. So this session today, pulling back from the brink, rebuilding and securing US democracy, is, I think, a really critical topic. It's one that Americans just thought, we did it. We owned it, we did it. So what do you have to do? And one thing I think that has been very humbling over the last few years, and even more actually, is that democracy always needs to be strengthened and secured, and we are not exceptional in any way, the United States. So thank you again for joining us. This session is part of a bigger Wednesday webinar sessions that we've been having, really looking at topics of what is driving conflict and instability in the United States, and more importantly, what do we do about it? So this has been an ongoing webinar series that we've had since April, and it will continue through the beginning of September. We'll be taking a bit of a hiatus in August, for a few weeks in August. But I encourage you to go check out the other sessions that are listed on the website, and also to attend other sessions coming up. Also, we have a U.S. Peace, Justice, Democracy Working Group for the Alliance for Peacebuilding. If you want to join, please contact us, and we're more than happy to have you join us. We do a lot on policy and advocacy. A lot of that work focuses in on holding our government accountable to the promises that they've made, and making sure resources are available so that the work can get done. I always say, if you can't fund it, then you can't do it. So again, welcome. We have some incredible panelists today that are really working on the front lines and innovative spaces, and we're thrilled to have them here. Of course, Theo Sittler is my co-moderator. He's a senior fellow at the Alliance for Peacebuilding and a long-term consultant working with us on US peacebuilding. Ashley Cuerco is with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Uriel Epstein is with Renew Democracy Initiative. Diana Aviv is with Partnership for American Democracy. So again, these are key leaders really pushing, pushing on these democracy issues that are so needed right now in the United States. So we're thrilled that they're here. Maria Stefan from the Horizons Project unfortunately couldn't be here with us today, but she did pre-record remarks, and we have put those all over social media, and we're also going to put those in the chat for you to take a look at. I highly recommend. She has a phenomenal article that came out on or around July 4th that really drills down into these democracy issues. So with that, I'm going to turn you over to Theo and our incredible panelists. So thank you again.
Well, thank you so much, Liz, for that introduction and for that framing. Um, I don't want to spend much time at all. I actually want to go ahead and turn to our incredible panelists to get the discussion started. And we're going to start with Ashley. And Ashley, I really wanted to turn to you and to kind of kick our conversation off uh, because of your research experience, the work that you're doing globally. You were a member of a task force that was tasked to develop a strategy to support democracy and counter authoritarianism worldwide. And of course, the task force produced a report and made recommendations on US strategy to support democracy globally. So I'm wondering if you could, from your perspective, from where you sit, if you can set a global put what's happening here in the U.S. in a global context for us. What's happening around the world in terms of democratic decline and backsliding. And as Liz said, the U.S. is not exceptional. We need to continue to work hard to secure and protect our democracy here. But that fits in with a trend that's happening globally. So I'm wondering if you could kind of set that context for us, Ashley.
Well, thank you, Theo. I'm happy to do that. And also thanks to AFP for convening this conversation and for inviting me to be a part of it. So yes, I'm here to, I guess, provide some international comparative perspective. So I'd like to just start by kind of setting the stage for the state of global democracy prior to the pandemic, because I think the pandemic adds another layer to kind of the state of where democracy is here and overseas as well. But even in advance of the pandemic, we have been in the midst of a decline in global freedom that has really been occurring for nearly 15 years, according to the nonprofit Freedom House. There's another research institution that characterizes this in a different way. This is the Varieties of Democracy Index. And they would say that now nearly 70% of the world's population is living in a closed or electoral autocracy, while the number of liberal democracies continues to decline. So this democratic depression that we are seeing has been evident across the democratic spectrum, from the most established democracies to countries on every continent. And the causes are really multifaceted. They stem from both internal sources as well as external pressures. And so in some countries, it is really external attacks from aggressive authoritarians. We've seen much more aggressive efforts by authoritarian governments to place pressure on democracies, particularly those that are in their neighborhood region sphere of influence. They do so by, interfering with elections, by deploying and marketing digital surveillance technologies that strengthen these would-be dictators in countries that align themselves with external foreign actors. In other countries, it's more internal threats, right, that are challenging democratic systems. Threats like extremism, populism, polarization, and corruption that really are undoing the tenets of free and open societies. And many countries, many democracies have also fallen short in responding to policy crises, from everything from global migration to, the economic dislocation engendered by globalization, the climate, changing climate and its impacts, and corruption. And then finally, you have countries that have both the internal challenges as well as the external pressures and are struggling to respond to that. So it's a really complicated picture, multifaceted set of reasons. And I think it's important then to sort of take that broader context and zoom in on the last, 18 months, where we've had, on top of this, a pandemic emerge as a sudden and deeply destabilizing shock, obviously to our public health systems, to our economic systems, but also to our systems of governance and most governments, which have struggled to respond. And I'd say, in most cases around the world, we saw democracy, democratic norms and standards further retract. right? As governments tried to respond to the pandemic, governments issuing states of emergency, lockdown measures, often with quite harsh enforcement. We did see democracies overall perform better, be more resilient in terms of these violations. They bounced back. They reduced these violations of democratic practice more quickly than less democratic or autocratic countries. And I think that was a positive sign. But we did see, even in democracies that were already more fragile, right, already more vulnerable to this larger trend of democratic backsliding, we have seen the pandemic really exacerbate those weaknesses, particularly, in three main areas. First, in media freedom. So we've seen real restrictions on media freedom be the overwhelming majority of kind of violations of democratic standards over this past 18 months. And that has taken place again across consolidated democracies all the way to the other side of the spectrum. Governments are imposing restrictions on journalists who are covering the pandemic, as well as government response to the pandemic in a whole slew of ways, including, jailing journalists, arresting journalists and jailing them, imposing fines, closing down media houses. In some countries, this has a real chilling effect on journalism. It encourages self-censorship, and we could see, this have a longer-term impact on watchdog journalism, et cetera. We've also seen, governments accelerate their efforts to regulate misinformation, obviously a huge problem in the US, but globally in terms of the pandemic. And while we've seen some countries really try to use laws to meaningfully combat the spread of misinformation, in many places we've seen, government officials use these measures to sort of further crack down on dissent, further lock in their power, et cetera. So arresting, again, people for spreading fake news, et cetera. So that's one kind of major dimension in post-pandemic. I think a second one is this erosion of human rights, and that's really taken a variety of forms. So first, we've seen, really abusive law enforcement in at least half of countries around the world, with at least some violations in this way. Most of these have been in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. But this has been a prominent problem around the world. The second thing is increase in discrimination, in scapegoating, and in sanctioning of minority communities. Everything from the labeling of Muslims in India and Sri Lanka as super spreaders of COVID, to the detention of migrant workers and refugees in Latin America, to hate crimes committed against Americans of Asian descent in this country. And finally, we've seen, in some cases, the retraction of civil liberties like freedom of assembly, though I'm optimistic that we'll see those kind of correct themselves. It's more of a short-term impact. And then finally, we have this impact on a reduction of government transparency and accountability. And I did some research on this in the US specifically, and also more broadly. And I think we have both, this impact on media freedom in terms of being a watchdog over government action in this time. We also have more limited government capacity to respond to public information requests. Like, people are not working in the office. People have limited staff capacity. They can't always respond to FOIA requests, et cetera. So you have a lot of these sort of lack of ability to provide the access to the information in a time when we really need that access to information. At the same time, you also have deliberate government efforts to hide information, to mislead, to misinform about the coronavirus from the public. Again, an issue that has plagued the U.S., but it isn't unique to the U.S. Tanzania, Brazil, India, other places where the government has taken those kinds of measures. So at the same time we have this lack of information, we also have a time when government is taking massive action, right, to combat the virus, massive government outlays of funding to respond to the public health crisis, to the economic crisis, often distributed hastily without sort of meaningful mechanisms to monitor those funds. And I think, at best, we see that lead to waste, fraud, and abuse. At worst, we see it as providing massive opportunity for corruption. And again, this is certainly a trend that we have seen globally with the lack of oversight over COVID response. So I would say that sort of wrap some of this up by saying democracy is fragile everywhere. It was before the pandemic. The pandemic has made it more so. I'd also say that the vulnerabilities, democratic vulnerabilities across different countries are quite similar. And so that gives us an indication of what are the areas of risk and also where are the areas that need engagement, shoring up, and improvement. And so I think that creates a lot of opportunity for cross-learning, for comparative learning across democratic the experiences of democracies. And I think it's great to the extent that we can have conversations like this one where we are bringing in this kind of comparative perspective. The second thing I'd say is democracy in the United States, of course, matters tremendously here for our own citizens, for our sense of national identity, stability, our prosperity. But it clearly matters in a global context. And the sort of democratic weakness and dysfunction here at home not only weakens our standing abroad, but it really undermines our ability to stand with and to sort of stand with a shrinking number of democratic nations, right? This number of liberal democracies is declining, and helping, to shore up, fighting those forces of decay that are helping to erode democracy globally. I'd say there's a few lessons that I've had from my own work overseas, and I know, Theo, you mentioned the Freedom House Task Force, which also makes a lot of recommendations about sort of what we might do to address the global democratic sort of decay that I've talked about. And those, I encourage those of you who haven't to read it. The report is called Reversing the Tide. And it does go into several strategies that deal with some of these issues, including, misinformation, corruption, et cetera. So I'm happy to talk about those, especially if we get into Q&A, but I just want to say a couple of other things about what it will take to do this work from my international experience working in democracy support. One is that this work takes resources. In other countries where I've worked, they don't have well-developed resource bases, so they rely on international donors to support this work. But the work costs money, and it costs more money the bigger the country. So this is work that needs large and sustained investment. As we are building up our own democracy sector, we are in many ways behind countries that have been working on building up a democracy sector that they've been doing over the last several decades. And so we have kind of work to do, and we have to know that that's going to take sustained investment to do so. Second, we need strategy. This is a multidimensional sector, it's a multidimensional problem set. It requires a multidimensional approach. And that means we also need to think about opportunities to both reflect on what we're doing, adapt, iterate, and learn. And that's part of what kind of strategy needs to involve. The last thing we need is coordination. I think what I've been so interested in is sort of this proliferation of activity in the sort of democracy sector in the US. And I think it's a wonderful blossoming, but it needs coordination. I think, Liz, you mentioned earlier about the need for some kind of government focal point that can help coordinate government action on these issues. But I think we also need to think about coordination mechanisms for non-government actors, for civil society, because coalitions need to come together at strategic moments, like an election, if we want to sort of field some kind of domestic election observation, for example. And in a country as large as the US, there's a case for these kinds of coordination mechanisms, both at a national level, but also subnationally at other levels. I think the final thing I'll say is in other countries, it's often donors who pull these pieces together. So in the US, that probably isn't what we want or need. So who are going to play these roles? I think those are important questions for us to consider as we do this work in the US. Thanks.
Ashley, thank you so much. That I feel like that really sets the stage for us really well. And one particular thread that I wanted to at least mention here is that democracy is fragile everywhere, and I think that's a theme that kind of at least in my mind we keep coming back to. And I really wanted to, as we go down the line, I mean, turn to Uriel and the work that RDI is doing, Uriel. I mean, you all were set up as an organization to help shape the narrative, to kind of work in that middle space, if you will, to use content and media to help shape the narrative and to educate the American public on democratic values and constitutional principles. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, working in that kind of fragile space, if you will, right? And working to shape the narrative. What does that look like to you? And what does your work kind of like looking down the horizon? How do you kind of hope to do that?
Awesome. Thank you, Theo, and thank you, Ashley, and thank you, everyone, for being here. Yeah, so why don't I really quickly just begin by introducing RDI for those that don't know. The New Democracy Initiative was founded in late 2017 by Garry Kasparov. For those that aren't familiar, he's considered one of the greatest chess players in history. He's also one of Vladimir Putin's greatest opponents. And therefore, as you can imagine, the last year or so has been a challenge as he's been reconsidering where in the world he can safely travel. He's been in exile from Russia since 2013 or 2012. And then he was joined initially by a group of folks whom he semi-jokingly refers to as refugees from the Wall Street Journal. So these are Bret Stephens, Max Boot, Mark Glasswell, and then a number of other fellow travelers joined the organization, ranging from two former Democratic senators, Heidi Heitkamp and Bob Kerrey, to Michael Steele, the former head of the RNC, to most recently Alexander Vindman, the key whistleblower in the first impeachment hearing. And the reason for everyone coming together essentially was to offer kind of a uniquely cross-partisan, post-partisan space for discussion of key liberal democratic principles. Ultimately, those are the things that brought everyone together, and the realization that the danger that really the relevant political divide was no longer between left and right. The relevant political divide was between those who wanted to blow the system up and those who wanted to work within the system in order to fight for incremental improvement. And as a result, there's this realization and that radicalization, whether it comes from the left or the right, can be equally dangerous. And so when you look abroad, and Ashley, sort of to your point of looking at this from kind of an international perspective, which RDI also frequently does, whether you look at dictatorship in Venezuela, in Cuba, or you look at the burgeoning authoritarianism in Hungary, Poland, Brazil, the Philippines, needless to say, some of those are on the right, some of them are on the left. Regardless, the effects frequently are the same. And so that's one of the key things that I think people don't actually quite recognize, that authoritarianism is ideologically agnostic. And so the mission of RDI is twofold. One, we want to educate the general public around core liberal democratic principles. And two, and most importantly, we want to help them prioritize those principles in their civic behavior. So before I get into a little bit more on kind of tactics and what that means to shape the narrative, I want to take a little bit of a step back and just sort of define the field as I see it in any case in the pro-democracy community. There are roughly four ways that people can look to influence the political system. Certainly in the US, although arguably you can sort of say that this would be relevant in other countries as well, at least democratic ones. And the first one is very obvious, direct politics, right? You can essentially work to elect whomever you think is going to be the best candidate for whatever office it is that you're focused on. Now, of course, the challenge with doing that is that person will face the same incentives and the same structure that his or her predecessors have. And so therefore, you can elect the best person in the world, but once they get into Congress or into the governor's office or into the presidency, ultimately they're going to be faced by the same incentives, and therefore we may often find that the results are not radically different because no single individual can fundamentally change the system in that way. And so obviously very much worth doing. But that's the challenge with the sort of direct election approach. The second approach is lobbying, and essentially you focusing on those people who are already in office and trying to get them to either prioritize or to think differently about any number of different issues. And there are a number of groups which are doing this incredibly successfully. ranging from R Street to the Niskanen Center, to far too many to count. Then there's the third group, which is the one that I think people think about most frequently when they think about pro-democracy organizations, and that's the systemic reform group. These are going to be the groups that are fighting for redistricting reform, ranked choice voting, any number of other good governance reforms. And now all of these are incredibly necessary, and there are a lot of groups that are doing incredibly good work on this. And originally, I actually had believed that this was what RDI would also be working on. And then what actually happened was I had a number of conversations on this. And the one that stood out the most to me was a conversation that I had with my own mother. My mom is an immigrant from this former Soviet Union. English is her third language. And I can make a joke about whether or not that's about average, that makes her English about average in the US. Perhaps I'll refrain from making too strong a statement there. But when I remember I was speaking to her about gerrymandering and, explaining to her what gerrymandering is. And I remember thinking that this was going to be a home run. I mean, it's really just an obvious thing. If you get 40% of the votes, you should have 40% of the seats, period. If you have 40% of the votes and 60% of the seats, that's unjust. It's a relatively easy thing to understand. But I was talking to her over the phone, and as I was explaining this to her, I could literally hear her eyes glazing over. Ultimately she agreed with me, sure. But the fact is that never in a million years would she vote based on a candidate's position on gerrymandering. It wasn't a part of her identity. It wasn't a part of it wasn't a part of an issue that she really cared about. And I think that's true for the vast majority of people. And so that brings me to the fourth category, and the one in which the RDI operates, and that's sort of general public communications. And I think right now, this is the category that is least well understood. It's a category that's understood the best by the radicals, by members of the far left and the far right. And unfortunately, at least in the online media landscape right now, it's dominated by players in that space. You've got Prager University on the far right. For those that aren't familiar with the name Prager, you may well be familiar with the names Ben Shapiro or Candace Owens. And of course, these are people who are demagogues, and they take the most extreme possible positions in order to generate as much outrage as humanly possible. And therefore, they represent some of the single most popular videos on platforms like Facebook. And they are, and then meanwhile, on the far left, you've got the Gravel Institute, which a few months ago put out, some content essentially arguing that private property is theft. And again, using actually many of explicitly the same exact tactics that PragerU uses, but have just literally flipped on their head. And there does not right now exist an organization that seeks to do what they do, but for the reasonable, more reasonable, arguably more moderate people who are willing to prioritize process over outcome, and liberal values and principles over specific policy priorities. And that's something that's incredibly necessary. And those groups that do exist that prioritize these things, unfortunately, they're frequently not very exciting. And the communications that we've seen come out of those groups do one of two things. Either A, they target only the elites. So many members of RDI's board are people who will openly admit to being read primarily by elites. And there's, of course, a good reason for that. I mean, there's significant value in that as well. But that still leaves a incredibly wide swath of the population that is underserved in the sort of liberal democracy category. And so ultimately, that's what we're looking to do. Now, how do we actually do that? Tactically speaking, what does that look like? So at a very high level, that means trying to make liberal democracy a part of people's identity, which is an incredibly difficult thing to do. There was a study out of Yale that came out a few years ago, which literally kept me up for a few nights. And basically what that study found was that even for those who on a scale of 1 to 10 rank the importance of liberal democracy between 8 and 10, even among those people, just 3-point-something% were actually willing to prioritize liberal democratic principles in their voting behavior. And so what does that actually mean? What does that look like in practice? So in Montana, there was this really interesting natural experiment that happened where a Republican candidate for Congress, Gianforte, For the, I don't know if folks here remember this, but he literally physically tackled a journalist. He physically assaulted a journalist. And what was interesting about this was that it happened, I think, a day or two before the election. And so absentee ballots had already come in. And those, of course, this was pre the 2020 election, and therefore absentee ballots had not yet been politicized, which means that absentee ballots would be equally representative of both Republicans and Democrats. And what the researchers of the study found was that after he assaulted the journalist, he saw just a 3% drop in support. And that was it. And in some precincts, he actually saw an increase in support. So in other words, there were some people who originally thought that, no, Gianforte, it's too mushy for me. He's too much of a squish. He's not what I'm looking for. And then, of course, after he physically assaults a journalist, they said, oh, there's my guy. That's something I can get behind. And of course, that's terrifying. Now, it's not a problem that's unique to the right. They found these statistics to be just as true on the left. And what's even more interesting is that they found that these numbers got worse and worse as people became more and more partisan. So as you move further to the left and further to the right, you were less likely to hold your co-partisans to account for anti-democratic behavior. Meanwhile, those who believed themselves to be closer to the center, more moderate, they were willing to hold their co-partisans to account at approximately 11%, 11% of the time, whereas those who are more partisan, around 3% and less. So what does that mean for us? That means that there are two things. One, that means that moderation, there is value to moderation, not just, for whatever policy, for, preferences you have, but also from the point of view of actually defending democracy, because ultimately it's moderates that are actually willing to prioritize process over outcome. And two, it means that we need to prioritize making these liberal principles and these classic constitutional values a part of someone's identity. Right? They need to see themselves as someone who prioritizes those things and not just as a Republican voting for Republicans or a Democrat voting for Democrats. And so that's going to be an incredibly challenging thing to do. But that's a lot of what RDI does. And so how do we want to go about doing that? A lot of it comes down to sort of what I would like to say the moment. Basically, anytime we can put something out that will make someone say, And one of the ways that we're looking to do this is by making people understand that just because America is a liberal democracy does not mean that it needs to stay that way. And there's a lot that we can use from an international point of view that I think might be able to slip past people's partisan shields in order to make that point. So as one example, we'll be doing a series on Venezuela and the fall of Venezuela from flawed liberal democracy to modern day authoritarian communist regime, suffering from hyperinflation and God knows what else. And that's something that actually I think it will be incredibly meaningful for people, because again, if you look at Venezuela in the late 70s and 80s, it is recognizable. I mean, it's a country that at that time was very much the envy of the southern of South America, and so that's going to be one approach that we're going to be taking. Another approach that I think is actually very interesting is looking at we've basically been working with dissidents from authoritarian regimes around the world, and this is a project that we've been working on for a little while, and it'll be coming out in the fall. So I can't offer too many details yet, although if there's anybody out there who'd be interested in partnering with us, please do reach out to me. But basically, we've collected dissidents from 24, 25 oppressive countries, and we're working with them in order to convey their perspectives within the US and convey their visions of the US to a broader swath of the American public. And there are three key reasons for why I think that's important. The first two have to do with the fact that they're going to be able to call out the excesses of both the left and the right without having either side being able to accuse them of shilling for the other, right? So whether they're calling out the kind of an environment that lends itself to censorship on the left, or whether they're calling out voter suppression or other such things on the right, they're going to have credibility in doing so. And then third, they can offer a perspective on America that's uniquely positive and that's uniquely inspirational, because all of these people have looked to the US as that shining city on a hill. You know, when they were risking their lives or their freedom fighting for democracy in their home countries, they would point to the US as a country to aspire to. And of course, when you have January 6th happening, I mean, these dissidents were horrified, right? I mean, many of them would go back, would speak to some of their colleagues in their home countries. Or alternatively, even worse, they would hear from their political enemies and from various authoritarians, basically saying, you know, look, this is what happens when you have democracy. Look at what's happening in your shining city on a hill. And that's something that's incredibly damaging. And it's one of the key reasons that fighting for democracy in the US needs to be one of our top priorities, if not the top priority, because ultimately, I do think this is very true, which is, you know, as America, so the world. So as whatever happens to democracy here, I think will be emulated and followed around the world as a whole. So with that, I will stop my monologue, and thank you again, everyone, for being here, and Theo for hosting.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Uriel. I mean, I will just say, you know, as someone, just me personally, as someone who considers myself to be a lefty, liberal, progressive, I think coming together and finding that space in the middle to be able to kind of move our democracy forward is something that's really intriguing to me. And certainly within AFP, within the Alliance for Peace Building, we've talked about the need for intra-group work that needs to happen, the polarization that happens, whether it's on the left or the right. We need to do work ourselves to ensure that we're not contributing to the polarization. So it's this incredible work that you all are doing. So thank you for that. So Diana, I wanted to turn to you. First of all, thank you for joining us. You are heading up a brand new initiative that was launched just a couple of weeks ago. It's very exciting. And you're working to kind of build this trans-partisan coalition that Uriel was just talking about, and making it as cross-sectoral as possible. And the work is centered around 5 pillars, as I understand it. So can you please give us an overview of what those 5 pillars are, what the work looks like, and ways in which our community can support your work and kind of come together to do that?
Well, thank you firstly for inviting me to be here. I think that the work that you're doing, that AFP is doing, is essential. I must say, Ashley, when you were speaking, I was thinking that you are the beginning of what I was going to say. That when you ended by saying what is needed, I was thinking, yes, 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 yes. All of the things you said we just did. And then, Uriel, when you were talking about this left-right thing, RD thing, and beyond that, I was thinking, yes, 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 that's also true. And what's amazing about this is that this is a global forum, and yet we're focusing on the United States, which is both necessary and tragic at the same time. Wish we didn't have to, but we are where we are. And what I wanted to share with you is that, as Theo said, we launched ourselves on July 1st, and deliberately picked that date because of its proximity to July 4th. And our goals are to engage in a whole bunch of activity between now and the 250th anniversary of our Constitution, which will be in 2026. But let me just share with you how we define the work in the United States. We firstly look at democracy with a very broad lens through 5 pillars or 5 spheres of engagement. The first one being civic education and all of the work related to that. The second one being service, AmeriCorps, that kind of work, volunteerism and civic engagement. The third one are the groups that work to bring people together, bridging the divide, people with very divergent views and finding ways for them to speak together and connect. The fourth one is the area that we're probably most familiar with, and those are all the political governance reform at the federal, state, and local level, and all the issues that relate to that kind of activity. And the fifth area is what we've described as mis and disinformation and the the degradation of local journalism. And another way of putting it is to say, to find language that is reliable, top quality information that can be trusted regardless of people's personal points of view or affiliations, and that becomes the basis of the way in which we move forward. I think, Ashley, when you described how groups are uncoordinated and we needed a common platform, that's exactly what we believe and do believe, is that even as these groups are doing profoundly important work and they are under-resourced, they know one another within the space that they work, but they're not coordinated across these pillars, and that even as there's a proliferation, even of coordinating groups, it's not the same as working across the board in a way that we need to. We also realize that because of the under-resourcing of groups, that when external events happen that cause the media to pay attention to these areas, these groups don't necessarily have the capacity to take advantage of the moment and to move their agenda forward. And so that there is a need for more resources, stronger attention, and a platform where these groups can come together and build on the work that's been happening. Add to that because of the crisis or the fragility of our democracy, there are a whole bunch of institutions that don't have democracy as their primary focus, but are deeply concerned about what's happening in our democracy. And they didn't know and don't know where to turn and with whom to align in a way that works. So in creating the Partnership for American Democracy, we wanted to bring together the groups that are interested and concerned about democracy and to add value to those groups that are already doing the work. So in doing that, we have created a coalition or a group of partners that range from religious organizations, higher education, all the presidents and councils and centers are part of our coalition. And there are many other groups as well, the military. And the purpose is to try and find groups that are connected to different pieces of the population, different components of the population, so that when different people in our society look at who's working with us, they feel comfortable that they can identify organizations or people associated with this work with which they feel comfortable. And then, as Uriel so beautifully described, the importance of being, if it's bipartisan, transpartisan, nonpartisan, whichever way we describe it, but having people whose ideological views span the spectrum, we felt it was absolutely essential to build an organization that looked like that as well. And so that as we build out Democrats, we have as many Republicans, and we have liberals, we have conservatives. So again, the point of view is that you may fight like heck about all sorts of things in our society, whether it's climate change, whether it's gun control, whether it's reproductive rights, all sorts. But when it comes to democracy, we're all in the same space. And that is that we have to strengthen it, we have to preserve it, and we have to grow it in a way that supports a United States that's a democracy. And part of the way in which we've decided to achieve our goals, both in the resource area and the intention area, is to create a national leadership council, in addition to the coalition of people that I was talking about. And that is also made up of people that span the spectrum ideologically, but also include people from different spheres of engagement, of life, and so on. Again, with the same rationale that those people can influence constituencies that I might not have access to, but they do, and yet they all care about democracy. We are just at the beginning of this, and I must say that I'm surprised that even in this short period of time, the 3 months leading up to our launch, and now we've got over 80 coalition members. We've got, I can't remember how many, but I think it's over 50 National Leadership Council members, because organizations are coming to us on a daily basis saying to us, how can we participate? And then I don't know whether to be pleased or sad about this, but I'm also finding that there are lots of American-based organizations focused globally who want to be part of this coalition, not just because they're working at the in the United States, and there are any number of global organizations who have sadly decided that the United States needs to be in the group as well of organizations of countries that need to be attended to, but also because there seems to be a need to have a connection so that we are all working together, both with the administration, the Congress, and also the work that we're doing. So we are making a place for that as well, because in the end, what we will be is a platform and a vehicle through which we can increase participation. I think just one last thing I'd like to say, and then rather keep most of the time for Q&A, because I'm sure there are a lot of people who've got a lot to say. In each of the spheres of engagement, there are 5 pillars that I described, and we've been working with them to identify what we've called, and this might be amusing, especially to this global community, SDGs. What we mean by SDGs are Sustainable Democracy Goals. And that in each of the pillars, they've identified a series of activities and actions and outcomes, not just outputs, but outcomes that they want to achieve by 2026. And we will continue to refine those so that we've got measurable outcomes by which each of these areas can measure their success and adjust their activities and strategies. Because it's not enough to be upset about democracy, we actually have to begin to change things. And so that just gives you a little bit of a picture of who we are and what we do.
Well, thank you, Diana. I do want to turn to our audience and encourage folks to type in questions into the chat or into the Q&A box. And while folks are doing that, maybe I'll throw out a question to our panelists. I mean, all 3 of you spoke about, there is a space and a need for government reform. So, in your work so far, particularly as we're, a little more than 6 months into the Biden administration, where, Liz talked about this at the beginning, where does this work of securing American democracy, securing democracy here at home, sit within the Biden administration? Are there points of engagement that are encouraging? Where are there gaps that we should be addressing? And maybe Diana, I can turn to you and then see if Uriel and Ashley have responses as well.
Well, Theo, firstly, I want to be clear that when I've described this very broad range from people who bridge the divide to people who do national service to people who do civic education, clearly those areas of engagement will connect with different parts of the administration, whether it's the Department of Education, whether it's wherever it is. It's the AmeriCorps, or, there are different spaces. That's number one. Secondly, one of the conversations that we've been having with any number of people who work extremely closely with both the administration and Congress is the challenge that we have in engaging in an active way on the one hand, but on the other hand, not politicizing the activity, because it seems that we're in such a divided universe at the moment that the moment this administration takes on an issue, that immediately puts up the backs of a whole bunch of Republicans who otherwise might have been warm to those ideas. So I think that I'm not sure if that's the question I would ask, as opposed to how do we get traction to achieve the outcomes that we want, and what role can the administration and members of Congress play, and is there a way to get, as Uriel was talking about, the bipartisan support that we need to make this a non-political, non-partisan issue that democracy is all about. Just one other point I'd say. We are actually at the point, I had a conversation, one of the groups that we are going to be bringing in, groups would be the wrong way to describe it, would be sectors would be better, is the business community. And I was talking to a Fortune 100 senior leader of a major company. And he's very interested in the work. Of course, the work he's interested in is service and volunteering and bridging the divide. He was not interested in reform because it was too risk inducing for him. And he said to me, is there any way that you cannot use the word democracy? So we are at a point now where we have to think about what language we use, how we articulate what we're saying, how do we convey to people in local communities what we're trying to achieve without them automatically assuming that as a result of the words we use, they conclude all sorts of things about us and therefore are not interested in the ideas. And so while I think that government reform is important and figuring out where in the White House it matters, I think that there are some other issues we have to attend to first.
Uriel or Ashley, if you had any responses, I'd love to hear your response. But I wanted to highlight a question. But go ahead, Ashley.
Just really briefly, I agree with much of what Diana said, but I also, I think that the one maybe thing we can draw on here is that democracy support, working on democracy overseas has been a bipartisan issue for decades, right? Especially on the Hill, there's been that bipartisan support precisely because of everything Uriel said about all of the ways in which we've seen and needed to support this work, in the countries that you discussed. So I think that's a sort of opportunity, is to see how we can better link the champions that are on the Hill for this work overseas and the mechanisms that they have been set up with bipartisan support and funded, like the NED, like USIP, and how we might replicate that kind of institution in the US.
And obviously I agree. One note that I might add is, we're in this, I think, moment in time when addressing a lot of the controversial issues head on within Congress is probably not realistic. I hope I'm wrong, but unfortunately, I don't see any evidence that there's going to be this resurgence of bipartisanship. I mean, as at the moment, they don't appear to be even capable of getting the infrastructure bill passed. So my own instinct, and this is kind of jumping off of what Ashley said, would be to try to find, and I'd really encourage a lot, the other folks in the pro-democracy community to think about this, try to find issues that might be going under the radar and that might not be as fraught as a lot of the things that we're doing. I mean, the reason, for example, that our DI is really pushing on the dissident front is because, as Ashley said, historically, there's huge bipartisanship there. I mean, if you look at, for example, the push to bring the Afghan translators home, who had, risked their lives for our troops, that was actually a bipartisan push. I mean, you had both Democrats and Republicans pushing the Biden administration to do the right thing. And I think if we were to find a couple of issues like that and try to use them essentially as icebreakers into kind of a more democracy-oriented bipartisan approach, that there could be, at least on the margins, I think, some interest in doing that.
Thank you. So one question that I wanted to pull out from the chat is about civil society organizations and grassroots organizations within the communities across the U.S. I mean, I think one advantage that we have here in the U.S. is that we do have a really strong civil society base across the United States. And the question particularly asks about mediation centers that are based within communities across the US. But I'm wondering if you all can, in your work, in your engagement, what role do you see at the very kind of local, hyper-local level? What role do you see civil society organizations playing a role in helping to push and promote democratic values in the US?
So maybe I'll start and say that I remember years ago reading Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, and he came here to study prisons and instead actually wrote a book about democracy. And he said, whereas in all of these other countries you have all kinds of government institutions making decisions, what struck me about America is the ordinary people coming together to solve problems in their communities, and that's always been a unique characteristic, or a wonderful characteristic of American life. And that still continues. I think that a lot of the local organizations, though, who work in this space of what we've been talking about, whether it's bridging the divides, the kinds of things we're talking about, will tell you that they're deeply under-resourced, and that the splits that we see at the national level are also reflected in local communities. In a previous job that I had before I came to this organization, I was meeting with a lawmaker on Capitol Hill who was the chairman of a particular committee on the Republican side. It was when the Republicans led in the Senate. And he said to me, Diana, can you get your local groups to come to my town hall meetings? Because the only way that I'm going to be able to support the issue that you and I both want me to support is if you get your local constituents to do that. So that the divides at the local level are there as well. And there are groups working to strengthen that. and that it's our job, I think, to find people who are worried about democracy, who haven't historically funded in this area, to step up and to invest, and for us to steer them in that direction as well.
And this is an incredibly under-resourced area, to Diana's point. In fact, Diana, I think General McChrystal is one of your advisors, and he's been pushing this for as long as I've known him, that the national national year of service, which I think would be incredible. And for the record, I don't think that needs to, and he says this, right, that it doesn't need to be military at all. It can be service in some element of your local community, or any number of different things, and it would be, I think, an incredibly powerful thing. And that's on the service side, and then on the political side, locally, I mean, if you look at these local party organizations, these are incredibly insular organizations that don't even remotely represent the broader public, like not even a little bit, right? Because they represent the most radical people that you could imagine, because those are the only people actually willing to invest the time and energy to in local party politics. And so as a result, you see the Arizona GOP censuring Cindy McCain, and you see GOPs around actually the country in various states censuring their respective representatives on the off chance that they happen to have spoken out against the big lie or January 6th. And so one of the things that I probably would encourage folks here to do, and I'll be the first to admit that RDI doesn't do this, that's not, it's not entirely within our domain, but is encourage people to get involved in their local party organization, whatever it is, Democrat, Republican, those organizations. You get 10 dedicated people and you can fundamentally change a state party. It's one of the things that I actually think would take would be, from an investment of time and energy and manpower, would be relatively cheap to do, and yet I think would pay very disproportionate dividends.
Yeah, so wanted to turn to the questions. One really intriguing question is, I mean, we talked about coming together on the principles of democracy. We may disagree on the issues. Are there particular issues that, from your perspective, that we can, that there's a transpartisan coalition that can come together to address, to actually help move the country forward? I mean, Uriel, you mentioned the infrastructure bill. This is an issue that both sides can agree that it's actually good for them politically, and yet they haven't been able to find a way forward yet. But we'll see. Are there issues like that we can kind of encourage the political parties to work on to move forward? There's a question in the Q&A about racial reconciliation. That is something that is very much needed in our country, addressing systemic racism. And of course, that's been extremely politicized, over the last year as well. How do you see people coming together to work on issues that there is political advantage for both sides to address, but haven't yet to find a way to do that?
So, Theo, I have to run in just a couple of minutes, so perhaps I can offer just a few quick thoughts before I hop, and I apologize for having to hop here. But so very quickly, I think there are a number of issues that folks would find would be appealing to both sides. But the one note that I would make is an overarching note, which is be careful of the language we use. So I'll take climate change, for example, right? Climate change is hypothetically something that should be an entirely bipartisan issue, right? I mean, it's something that affects all of us. It's something that can be determined for the most part using science and facts. It's something that should not really be ideologically driven, and yet it becomes ideologically driven. And one of the reasons I think that is because of the language that people use to describe it. So when climate change is discussed as a moral issue, and therefore people who are skeptical of it are unethical in some way or immoral, needless to say, that's going to alienate an entire constituency that might otherwise have been sympathetic. Meanwhile, if you were to try to talk to that constituency and speak to them about climate change from the point of view of, no longer being dependent upon Middle Eastern oil, or talking about the independence that it would allow the U.S. if we did not have, if we weren't as much of an oil guzzling nation, or the resilience of business and the possibility of new jobs, the possibility, talking about market externalities and how we could use the market to solve for these market externalities. I mean, there's any number of different approaches one could take when discussing climate change in order to talk to people on the right who might otherwise disagree or might otherwise be skeptical. But yet I see time and time again, many of my friends on the left using language that is just immediately going to alienate people. And I've seen the same thing happen on any number of issues. Now, again, I'm obviously focusing on this one issue. I mean, there's any number of, things you could talk about, but just in general, being cognizant of the language that is used and the terminology that is used and whether or not you're alienating people by using terminology that, only white college-educated liberals are going to know, or vice versa. I mean, I'm assuming this. Again, I don't know who's in the audience here, but again, that's, I think, an overarching thing that we should think about. And so alongside climate change, which I actually think could be a bipartisan issue, I also think that many issues in foreign policy, in international aid, in supporting dissidents around the world, supporting Hong Kong, defending the Uyghurs, all of the, there's so many of these issues which I think could be bipartisan if we actually prioritize them in the right way.
Thank you, Uriel. I know you do need to jump off, so thank you for joining our conversation. And Diana, go ahead.
I just want to offer a slightly different perspective on this particular issue and say that, and I say this with sadness, that I think that most of members of Congress are followers and not leaders, and that getting a couple of them to work together might solve a particular issue, but it won't solve the bigger problem. And that in the end, we have to have people at the local level more connected, better understanding of what's important and coming together so that the message to lawmakers is work together or else, solve this or else. And the or else being, or we won't have you. We also have a political system where the kinds of people who get into office are in some ways the more extremes of the party because of our whole political system. And so the question is, there's so many things that have to happen at the same time. We have to have people's attitudes change. To do that, we've got to have a whole media campaign to do that in the way that Uriel was talking about, with language that is responsive, with messages and messengers to people who can hear it from those folks around them because it feels comfortable to them and they don't feel threatened by it. And then those people need to be connected to their lawmakers and let them know what's important. I think that if we don't do this all hands on deck, where we do it at the local level, where we do it at the national level at the same time, we will always be catching up with ourselves.
Can I just piggyback here, because this is what I think is so interesting, is because if you think about from the global perspective and you and the work that AFP does from a peace building perspective, this is exactly how we think about solving this kind of whole of society problem, right? We think about the individual level, we think about the institutional level, we think about the societal sort of socio-cultural level of change, all of those changes that have to happen. We think about intergroup work and intragroup work, right? Like the work that needs to be done within communities and the work that needs to be done between communities. And all of those things sort of inspire different kinds of interventions, right? They all working with institutions within groups versus across groups. Those are different kinds of interventions. And I think it's a really useful, framework to help us think about what we might need in the US. And I think you're PFAD or Diana, you're exactly trying to push us to sort of develop this much more holistic, comprehensive approach that recognizes individual level work absolutely needs to happen as much as we're doing institutional work. And I think in the US, we have been very focused for a long time on institution and really Congress, so that we have been disproportionately focused on sort of promoting bipartisanship when that was sort of never, increasingly disincentivized to work. And we haven't done the work at the individual level. We haven't done this broader social and cultural transformation that someone put in the chat that we need to do. And so we do need to work at all those levels. And I think that there's, again, good cross-learning that happens from this international experience on that.
Yeah, absolutely. As we're kind of looking to wrap up, I was, one thing I wanted to ask is, as you both are looking forward, particularly as we, as 2021, as we come to a close, and we're looking at 2022 as an election year, and of course beyond that, in the kind of the political life cycle, we soon start talking about 2024 as the next kind of election cycle. What, from your perspective, kind of what do you see happening? What is it that keeps you up at night? What is it that worries you? And what are those places that kind of give you hope for our country as we move forward?
Ashley, I'll give you the last word, so I'll go first. There's so many things that give me hope, but there are also a lot of things that worry me terribly. And I'm deeply worried that our democracy is very fragile, and that if in fact some of these bills prevail and voters are limited in their access, and the rules that govern what is an acceptable vote and what isn't in state legislatures result in a distortion of our election in a way that undermines our democracy, I think that in the end, that will be more profound than just about all the other things combined. It doesn't matter about conversations, of bridging the divide if we in fact destroy our democracy in the process. Now, I must tell you that there are some people on the right who think that the folks on the left are exaggerating some of the of what's happened at the state level. So having reliable, accurate, high quality information to understand what's happening and what pushback happens, because it's about an exercise in power. The Dems want to prevail, and they want to have a greater majority in the House and in the Senate, and they want to keep the White House for longer than just one term. The Republicans want the opposite. And so part of this is about a play for what they can do. And when we don't have rules where anything goes, and that there is no set of independent arbiters in this kind of situation, we are at risk. Now, this past time, we did have the courts intervene in a way that, or respond, not intervene, they didn't intervene, they responded in a way to lawsuits and so on that kept our democracy at least intact for now. But that's my biggest worry. And I also worry that when we, in these 2-year cycles, in 2022 and 2024, the deep work that Ashley was talking about of having all hands on deck, having all institutions focused, suddenly become really focused in a particular way on the off-year election, as opposed to keeping our work and grinding out the kind of work we need so that in 5 years' time, we'll be in the place we want to be, rather than breaking apart on account of the elections. The good news is that there are a lot of people worried about this. All kinds of sectors are coming to us. I've been talking to a whole bunch of presidents in the higher education space. And they've been saying to me that they are concerned about, they do all kinds of democracy work with students, getting them to vote, having conversations there, having institutes, but they want to play on the largest stage. They want to lend their power and influence and credibility to the largest stage. Excellent. Come on board. And for those groups, we may not focus on 2022, but there will be others that will focus on 2022 as we keep on working at the deeper level at the same time.
I really agree with everything Diana said. And just to underscore this idea of, democracies really break down when people no longer agree on the rules of the game, right? People don't agree on the rules by which we're going to compete our political power. And the US, those rules are being so contested right now. And if people don't buy into them, if they no longer believe that they're legitimate, they aren't going to adhere to the results. And I think you're right, Diana, that the sort of the debate around voting, et cetera, right now is one example of this being a really critical question of concern. And I think, not unrelated to that, but related to elections as well, is just the rising levels of political violence that we have seen. There's a new actors, ACLED and the Bridging Divides initiative at Princeton that have been monitored this over the last election cycle and sort of trying to sort of prepare us for that in 2020. And I think think those risks are likely to, especially because we have these high stakes local debates about election rules and eligibility and participation, that we might see that kind of violence increase over the next election cycles. So that does worry me. The thing that gives me optimism is the amazing levels of mobilization I think we saw really for the first time domestically in this country in 2020 around the elections. Is civil society groups, from everything from sort of monitoring these incidents of violence to engaging with businesses to get them to issue statements about the election, the effort to make every vote, to sort of make every vote count and encourage people to be patient and wait for the results. There was just amazing kinds of coordination and communication with different civil society coalitions around this election to pull in business, to pull in religious leaders, et cetera. And I'm optimistic that is something that was really helpful this time. And I think there's an opportunity to really build on that for the next set of election cycles and expand it and help to mitigate some of the risks that we are worried about.
Well, thank you so much. One thing that I'm certainly heartened by is the kind of coalitions that are coming together. And Diana, I think I'm very excited for the initiative that you're leading, and look forward to seeing more. And to our audience, I mean, please watch out for the post-show page. We'll be posting links to all of the resources that we discussed, and ways in which that you all can plug in. And quite honestly, I mean, I'm very worried about our democracy, but I'm also heartened that there are so many different types of organizations and people and across the sectors who are coming to work on this. So thank you to all of you for joining us. Thank you especially to Ashley and for Diana for joining us. Uriel had to hop off a little bit early. He had a meeting that came up that he had to attend. And so thank you all of you. The recording will be posted post the show, and have a good rest of your day and rest of your afternoon. Thank you all. Bye-bye.